She stood in front of me, her lips still glistening from the kiss she had just given another man. My wife. The woman I had spent the last 7 years of my life loving, providing for, and protecting. And yet, here she was, smiling, flushed, and holding a vase she had bought for him. Not for me, not for our home, for him. The weight of betrayal pressed against my chest, but I didn't let it show. I had been a fool once, blinded by love, by loyalty. Not anymore. I looked at the delicate vase in her hands, the one she had, chosen so carefully, wrapped so tenderly, like a symbol of her affections. A mere object, but it spoke louder than any words ever could. She had never gifted me anything with such sincerity. Not once. Diane finally noticed my presence, her expression faltering for a split second before she smiled, forced, nervous. "Jeffrey, what are you doing here?" I could hear the tremor in her voice. She wasn't expecting me. She thought she could do this in secret, slip back into our bed, and pretend she was still mine. As if I hadn't just watched her press her lips to another man's cheek. As if I hadn't seen the way her fingers lingered against his wrist. I exhaled slowly, masking my fury with a look of indifference. I had learned long ago that anger, when controlled, is the sharpest weapon of all. "Nice vase," I murmured, stepping closer. "Must be someone special." Her hands clenched around the package. She forced out a laugh, shaking her head. "It's just something for a friend. A friend." That's what she was going to call him. That's what she was going to reduce this to. A casual kindness, nothing more. I could see it in her eyes. She was already preparing her excuses, her reassurances, her carefully woven lies. I had spent years giving her my loyalty, my heart, my everything. But love has a way of turning into something else when it's been stepped on one too many times. And so, I did not confront her. I did not explode. I simply smiled and said, "I see." Because now, I had a plan. A vase for another man? Fine. She had no idea what was coming. I used to believe that love, when given freely and without conditions, would always be returned in kind. That devotion meant something. That a promise whispered between two people in the quiet of the night would last forever. But I was wrong. My name is Jeffrey, and for 7 years I had been the perfect husband. Or at least I had tried to be. I built a life for Diane piece by piece with my own 2 hands. When we first met, she had nothing. No career, no stability, just dreams that seemed too fragile for reality. And I had been the fool who thought I could give her everything she lacked. I worked late nights so she wouldn't have to struggle. I paid off her student loans so she could chase her ambitions without burden. I introduced her to the right people, made sure she was always in the right rooms, and pulled every string necessary to elevate her career. When she got her first big break, she cried in my arms, whispering about how she could never have done it without me. I should have known that love built on gratitude never lasts. Somewhere along the way, the woman who once held my face in her hands and swore I was her world began to change. The warmth in her voice cooled. The way she touched me became absent-minded, like an afterthought. But I ignored it. I convinced myself that she was just busy, that her career was demanding. I made excuses because the alternative was too painful to accept, that the woman I had poured my life into was already slipping away. And then came Gerard. At first, he was just a name she mentioned in passing. "Gerard helped me with my project today," she'd say with a casual shrug. "Gerard suggested this new restaurant. Let's try it sometime." I should have noticed how frequently he entered our conversations. I should have seen how her eyes lit up when she spoke about him in a way they hadn't for me in years. But the heart is blind when it wants to be. I told myself it was nothing. That she was just excited about work. That Gerard was simply a colleague, a mentor, an important connection. After all, Diane wasn't the kind of woman who would betray the man who had given her everything, or so I thought. The truth unraveled, slowly, like a thread being pulled from a sweater until the whole thing came apart. The late nights at the office that didn't add up, the phone calls she took in hushed tones, stepping out of the room whenever I walked in, the sudden inexplicable distance that settled between us, and then today. I hadn't meant to follow her. I wasn't the kind of husband who tracked his wife's every move. But something about the way she left the house this morning, hurried, anxious, her perfume a little too strong, made something in my gut twist. So I followed, and that's how I found myself watching my wife buy a gift for another man. Not just any gift. A vase. Carefully chosen, delicately wrapped, held with reverence in her arms. And then, after she handed it to him, she leaned in, pressing, a kiss to his cheek as he chuckled, his hand resting lightly on her waist. Something inside me snapped, but not in the way you'd expect. There was no explosion of rage, no dramatic confrontation in the middle of the street. Instead, a cold realization settled over me. Diane was gone. The woman I had loved, the woman I had sacrificed for, she no longer existed. The person standing before me smiling at another man was someone else entirely. And yet, she still had the audacity to look surprised when she turned and saw me standing there. Her eyes widened, lips parting slightly before she quickly composed. Herself, her grip tightening on the vase as if that could shield her from the weight of my gaze. "Jeffrey," she said, her voice carefully controlled, like she was trying to gauge how much I had seen. "What are you doing here?" It was almost laughable. What was I doing here? I should have asked her the same thing. I should have demanded answers, confronted her with all the evidence of her betrayal. But something in me shifted at that moment. I was done asking for explanations, was done begging for love that was no longer mine. I had been the perfect husband. I had given her everything. And yet, she had taken all that love, all that effort, and turned it into dust beneath her feet. I would not be the fool she pitied. I smiled, slow and deliberate, watching her carefully. "Nice vase," I said casually. "Must be someone special." Diane blinked, hesitation flickering across her face. She forced a laugh, shaking her head. "It's just for a friend." A friend. That's what she was calling him. That's what she had reduced this to. I should have been angry. I should have lashed out. But I didn't, because anger was a fire that burned too quickly. I wanted something colder. Something lasting. Love is a dangerous thing when it turns into something else. And at that moment, as I looked at the woman I had, once sworn to cherish for the rest of my life, I realized something. She may have bought a vase for another man, but I was going to buy something too, and she had no idea what was coming. I had always believed that when people betrayed you, they at least had the decency to feel guilty about it, that there would be a flicker of hesitation, a shadow of regret in their eyes. But as I watched Diane fumble with her words, still clutching that damn vase, I realized something. She wasn't sorry. She was only afraid she had been caught, and that was worse. She licked her lips, her eyes darting between me and Gerard, who stood awkwardly beside her, hands stuffed in his pockets. He didn't look guilty either. No, the bastard had the audacity to smirk, as if he had already won, as if he had taken something from me without consequence. Diane tried to fill the silence. "Jeffrey, I didn't let her finish. I didn't need to hear whatever excuse she had crafted in the last 10 seconds. I had heard enough lies over the past year to last a lifetime. Relax, I said, voice calm, controlled. You don't have to explain anything to me." She froze. That wasn't the reaction she was expecting. She had probably prepared for anger, for confrontation, maybe even for me to storm off like a heartbroken fool. But what she didn't know, what she would never see coming, was that I wasn't the same man she had spent years stringing along. Gerard chuckled under his breath. "Well, that's mature of you, Jeff. Some men can't handle their wives having male friends." I turned to him, slowly, deliberately, as if I were really considering his words, and then I smiled. You're right. Diane looked between us, confused, like she couldn't tell if we were joking or if this was some surreal nightmare she hadn't yet woken up from. But I saw the relief flicker in her expression. She thought she was getting away with this. She thought I was letting it go. And that's when I knew just how much she had underestimated me. I reached forward, brushing my fingers over the vase in her hands. It's beautiful, I murmured. Really, you have good taste. She swallowed hard. Jeffrey, I let my hand drop and took a step back, nodding to them both before turning on my heel. I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because while she had spent the past few months weaving lies and sneaking around, I had spent them learning, watching, preparing, and now it was my turn. Diane didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. She probably thought she needed to give me space, let me process things, wait until I was desperate enough to ask for an explanation. That was her mistake. Because while she was off, thinking she still had control, I was already setting my plans in motion. The next morning, I walked into the office, greeting everyone as if nothing had changed. And why should it? I was still Jeffrey. Still the man who ran the company like a well-oiled machine. Still the one who made decisions that shaped people's futures. The only difference was that now, I had made a decision about mine. Jamie, my secretary, was already waiting in my office, her usual poised and professional self. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," she greeted. I smiled at her. "Jamie, do you have a moment?" She nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "Of course. What do you need?" I leaned against my desk, watching her carefully. Jamie had been with me for years. Loyal, sharp, and always knowing exactly what I needed before I even asked for it. She had seen me at my best and at my worst, had been the one to smooth things over when Diane's absence became a little too noticeable at company events. And yet, I had never really seen her before. Not until now. I tilted my head, considering my words carefully. "If someone betrays you, Jamie, do you think they deserve a second chance?" She frowned slightly, as if the question surprised her. "That depends," she said slowly. "Did they make a mistake or was it a choice?" I smiled. Smart woman. "And if it was a choice?" Her eyes darkened and her voice was steady when she replied. "Then they never deserved you in the first place." I let out a low chuckle, shaking my head. "You always know the right thing to say." She shrugged, giving me a small smile. "It's part of the job." But I knew better. This wasn't just about her being a good employee. This was about her understanding, about her seeing people for what they truly were. And suddenly I knew exactly what I had to do next. I reached into my drawer, pulling out my phone, and scrolled through the contact list until I found the name I was looking for. The jeweler. The one Diane had raved about for months but never bothered to visit for me. I pressed dial. When the call connected, I spoke clearly, deliberately. "Want the most expensive necklace you have. No budget. It needs to be stunning." There was a pause before the jeweler responded, eager. "For your wife, sir?" I glanced at Jamie, who was watching me with quiet curiosity. And then, I smiled. "No," I said smoothly. "For my secretary." Diane had bought a vase for another man. She had kissed him, knowing it wasn't just a friendly gesture, knowing exactly what it meant. And now I was going to make sure she watched as I did the same. Only, unlike her, I wasn't going to be careless. I was going to make sure every single moment of my revenge was unforgettable. Diane's absence stretched through the night, then into the morning. No messages, no calls, just silence. I sat in our bedroom, the space we had shared for years, and looked around. Everything here had been built around us. Framed photographs of vacations that once felt like magic, gifts exchanged on anniversaries that had meant something once. I should have felt something. Anger, grief, maybe even heartbreak. But instead, there was only a hollow stillness inside me. The kind that comes after you've given too much for too long and finally realize it was never going to be enough. I laid back against the bed and stared at the ceiling, my fingers tightening around the sheets. How had it come to this? How had I let myself become a man so easy to betray? I could still see the way she had smiled at Gerard, the way her body had leaned toward him unconsciously, the way she had chosen a gift for him, something she had never done for me. It wasn't just about the vase. It wasn't even about the kiss. It was about what they meant. Diane had made a choice, a deliberate, thought-out choice, and that meant she had been making choices like this for a long time. I let out a slow exhale, dragging a hand down my face. What did she expect? That I would be broken? That I would beg for an explanation? That I would sit here in our house surrounded by memories, waiting for her to decide whether I was still worth loving? I wasn't that man anymore. My phone buzzed. For a split second, I thought it might be her. But when I glanced at the screen, it wasn't Diane's name that appeared. It was Jamie. Jamie. Your necklace is ready for pickup. Want me to send someone? Or should I go myself? I stared at the message for a long moment. It was just business. Just another efficient task completed with precision. But I could hear her voice in my head. Steady. Unshaken. Different from Diane's soft, calculated tone. I tapped out a reply. Me. I'll get it myself. I needed to do this. Not just to show Diane. Not just to even the score. But to prove something. To myself. That I was still in control. That I wasn't the one being left behind. I was the one making the decisions now. The drive to the jeweler felt longer than it was. Every streetlight, every familiar turn made memories crawl back into my mind. The dinners where Diane had laughed too hard at her phone while I sat across from her, pretending not to notice. The times she had come home late, breathless with flimsy excuses. The moments I had dismissed, thinking love meant trust, thinking love meant patience. I gripped the steering wheel harder. Love had made me blind. But not anymore. I parked outside the boutique, stepping into the cool, polished air of the high-end store. The jeweler greeted me with enthusiasm, showing me the necklace they had prepared. It was stunning, delicate yet bold, draped with precision, catching the light in ways that made it look almost unreal. Diane would have loved it, and that thought made me hate it. I smiled, cold and calculated. Wrap it up. The jeweler nodded, moving efficiently, not knowing this purchase wasn't about romance. It was about power. I left the store with the velvet box in hand and drove straight to the office. Jamie was at her desk, focused on something, but when she looked up and saw me, she frowned. You look... She trailed off, choosing her words. Carefully. Different? I supplied. She nodded, focused. I didn't respond. Instead, I placed the small, beautifully wrapped box in front of her. She blinked, looking from the box to me, confused. What's this? I tilted my head. Open it. She hesitated, then carefully undid the ribbon, lifting the lid. The moment she saw what was inside, her breath hitched. Jeffrey, she said quietly. This is... expensive? I finished for her. Her gaze snapped up to mine, searching my expression. Why? I leaned against the edge of her desk, watching her reaction. Do I need a reason? Jamie's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure she should. If this is about Diane, it's not, I interrupted, my voice smooth, steady. This is about me. And for the first time in years, that was the truth. Jamie studied me, eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Are you sure? I exhaled slowly. More than I've ever been. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, slowly, she lifted the necklace from its box, letting it catch the light. I watched as she fastened it around her neck, the contrast between the ice-cold jewels and the warmth of her skin almost poetic. Diane had kissed another man. She had given him a gift. She had chosen him in ways I had once believed were only meant for me, but she had no idea what was coming, because the next time she saw me, she wouldn't see a man waiting for her to explain. She would see a man who had already moved on. Diane came home 3 nights later. It was late, well past midnight, when I heard the front door click open. I didn't move from my place on the couch, a glass of whiskey resting between my fingers as I listened to the sound of her heels tapping against the hardwood floor. She hesitated in the entryway. I could hear her breathing, the way she was trying to gauge the situation before stepping further inside. Finally, she spoke. "Jeffrey?" I took a slow sip of my drink before answering. "You remember my name. That's a good start." She let out a small nervous laugh like she was trying to lighten the tension. I was going to call, but I figured I'd give you space." "Space?" I repeated, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "Is that what you call it?" She walked toward me, careful as if stepping too quickly would shatter the thin ice beneath her feet. "Jeffrey, please," she murmured. "I know what it looked like, but it's not. Save it." My voice cut through the room, sharper than I intended. I exhaled, rubbing my jaw before setting my drink down. "I don't want to hear excuses." She blinked at me, taken aback. I had never spoken to her like this before, not in all our years together. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, regret, or maybe just the realization that I wasn't going to make this easy for her. She sat down, across from me, tucking her hair behind her ear in that way she always did when she was nervous. "Jeffrey, I don't want to fight." "Neither do I." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Which is why I've decided to stop." She frowned. "Stop what?" "Stop chasing, stop asking, stop pretending like I don't see what's right in front of me." I tilted my head. "You love him, don't you?" Diane's lips parted slightly, and for a moment she looked like she might deny it. But then she closed her mouth, her throat bobbing as she swallowed hard. She didn't have to say it. Silence was just as damning. A strange sense of calm washed over me. There it was, the truth, stripped of all pretense. I stood up, grabbing my phone from the table and scrolling through my photos before turning the screen toward her. Diane's eyes widened. It was a picture from last night, a high-end restaurant. Me, sitting across from Jamie, a bottle of wine between us, but it wasn't just a dinner. Jamie was smiling, leaning in as I fastened the diamond necklace around her neck, the very one I had bought after watching my wife kiss another man. Diane's gaze flicked up to mine, something dark and unfamiliar flashing in her expression. What is this?" "Dinner," I said simply. "A gift." Her nostrils flared. "For Jamie?" I shrugged. "Why not?" Her voice tightened. "You bought her jewelry?" I watched her carefully. "You bought a vase for another man. And you kissed him." I leaned down, lowering my voice. "So why do you look so upset, Diane?" Her jaw clenched, her hands curling into fists against her lap. "That's not the same, Jeffrey." "No?" I arched a brow. "Because I did it out in the open instead of sneaking around? Because I didn't bother to hide it from you the way you did with him?" She was shaking now, her breath uneven. "She's your secretary, and Gerard is your friend." She opened her mouth, then closed it again, struggling for words. I just needed time to figure things out." I let out a quiet chuckle. Time. Right. She was panicking now. I could see it, the cracks forming in the foundation she had built so carefully. For the first time, she was the one grasping at control, and I was the one holding it. I walked past her, pausing only once I reached the stairs. "You should get some rest, Diane," I murmured. "We have a lot to discuss in the morning." And then I left her sitting there, speechless, drowning in the same uncertainty she had left me in. She had thought she could take her time, that I would be waiting for her to decide what she wanted, but she had no idea. Because while she was busy choosing, I had already made my decision. Diane's panic grew in the days that followed. She tried to pretend nothing had changed, tried to slip back into our routines as if the last week hadn't happened, as if I hadn't watched her betray me in broad daylight. She smiled at me in the mornings, placed her hand on my arm at dinner, and even started calling me at work, something she hadn't done in years. But it was too late. She could feel the shift. She knew something was different, because for the first time in our marriage, I was no longer the man waiting for her, and that terrified her. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for dinner, she finally snapped. "Where are you going?" she asked, trying to sound casual, but her voice was too tight, her eyes too sharp as they watched me fix my cufflinks in the mirror. "Out." "With Jamie?" I smirked, amused at how quickly she had started saying Jamie's name, as if it was poison on her tongue. "Does it matter?" Diane let out a sharp breath. "Jeffrey, stop this." I turned to her, tilting my head. "Stop what?" "This. Whatever game you're playing." She crossed her arms, trying to steady herself. "You're trying to make me jealous, aren't you? That's what this is about." I laughed, a low, bitter sound. "You think this is about you?" She blinked, as if my response had caught her off guard. I stepped closer, my gaze never leaving hers. "You kissed another man. You bought him a gift. You spent nights with him, knowing damn well what it would do to me." I let my voice drop, every word, landing like a blade. "And now, when I finally decide I'm done, you're upset?" She flinched but quickly masked it with anger. "I never—" "Don't lie to me," I cut her off, my voice cold. "Not now. Not after everything." Diane clenched her jaw, looking away. "It wasn't what you think," she muttered. "Then tell me," I said. "What was it?" She didn't answer, because there was nothing she could say. I exhaled sharply, shaking my head. "I was willing to give you everything, and for years I did. But do you know what I realized?" She looked up, wary. I was giving it to the wrong person. The words hit harder than anything else I could have said. I saw it in the way her body tensed, in the way her eyes darted toward the floor as if she couldn't stand to look at me anymore. For so long, I had been the one trying to prove my worth to her. But now, she was the one losing me. And she knew it. "Jeffrey," she tried again, stepping closer. "Please, we can fix this." I studied her carefully. The woman I had once loved beyond reason, the woman I had built my life around. And I realized something. I felt nothing for her anymore. No anger, no love, just emptiness. "I already have," I said quietly. Diane frowned. "What does that mean?" I took a slow breath before I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope. Her face paled the moment she saw it. She didn't have to open it to know what it was. Divorce papers. Her hands trembled slightly as she took the envelope from me, her fingers barely gripping the edges. You're serious?" I nodded. "Very." Diane stared at the papers as if they would disappear if she blinked. "Jeffrey, don't do this." "Why not?" I asked, my tone unreadable. "Isn't this what you wanted?" Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "No," she whispered. I arched a brow. "You were ready to throw me away for him." "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I pressed. "Tell me." "Because I was there, Diane. I saw everything." Tears pooled in her eyes, but they didn't move me. "Not anymore. I made a mistake," she admitted finally, her voice breaking. I got caught up in something that wasn't real. I was stupid, and She reached for my hand, but I stepped back before she could touch me. Her breath hitched. "Jeffrey, I don't want this." "But I do." Her lips parted, eyes wide, desperate. "Please," she whispered. I let out a slow sigh, shaking my head. "You had your chance." A silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. And then, as if the universe had been waiting for this exact moment, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. Jamie. Diane saw the name and sucked in a sharp breath, realization crashing over her. "You," she started, but she couldn't finish the sentence. I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "I told you, Diane." I was done chasing you. I picked up my keys and headed for the door. The last thing I heard before I walked out was the sound of the divorce papers slipping from her hands and hitting the floor. She had lost, and this time, there was no getting me back. The night air was crisp as I stepped out of the house for the last time. I didn't look back. There was nothing left for me there. The home Diane and I had built was now just a collection of empty walls and broken promises. I got into my car and drove, my mind clear for the first time in years. No more doubts, no more second guessing. The weight of everything I had carried, love, betrayal, resentment, was gone. I had won. By the time I arrived at the restaurant, Jamie was already there, waiting at a candlelit table. She looked up as I approached, her expression unreadable. "You came," she said softly. I smirked. "Wouldn't miss it." I sat across from her, letting the warmth of the moment settle over me. Jamie wasn't Diane, she never had been, but maybe that was the point. She picked up her wine glass, studying me carefully. "You're different," I chuckled. "Good different?" She tilted her head. "Depends. Did you finally let go?" I exhaled slowly, my fingers tracing the rim of my glass. "I didn't just let go," I murmured. "I made sure she watched me do it." Jamie leaned forward, intrigued. "And how did she take it?" I smirked. "Like someone who thought she'd always have the upper hand." A soft laugh escaped her lips. "You're ruthless." "Only when necessary." Jamie took a slow sip of her wine, then set the glass down. "So what now?" I thought about it, about everything that had led me here. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the slow, painful realization that I had spent years giving my love to someone who never truly valued it. And then I looked at Jamie, the woman who had always been there, steady and unshaken. "I start over," I said simply. Jamie arched a brow. "And Diane?" I leaned back, my smirk widening. "Oh, she's already started to fall apart, because I had done more than just hand her divorce papers. Before I left, I had ensured that Diane's affair with Gerard wasn't just something that lived in the shadows. It was now public. The whispers had already started among our social circles. The colleagues who once admired her were now looking at her differently. The clients who trusted her were second-guessing their partnerships. Her carefully built image, the one she had spent years crafting, was crumbling. And Gerard? He wasn't the kind of man to stand by a woman when things got messy. I had made sure of that. He had already started pulling away. I had seen it in the way he didn't fight for her, didn't reassure her. Diane had gambled everything, her marriage, her reputation, her security, on a man who had no intention of staying, and that, more than anything, was my final revenge. Jamie watched me carefully, as if waiting for me to say more. When I didn't, she smiled. "So you really are done with her?" I nodded. "Completely." She raised her glass. "Then here's to new beginnings." I picked up mine, clinking it against hers. "To better choices." The night stretched on, laughter replacing old wounds, conversation filling the spaces where pain once lived. Diane would spend the coming months trying to undo the damage. She would fight to hold on to the life she had built on deception, but it wouldn't matter. Because I wasn't the one suffering anymore. She was. And that was the difference between us. She had lost me, and I had already moved on.